So you're on your way to school or work or uni or the local porno theater, and your path takes you past a shallow pond. There's no one else around, but you hear, what's that? A faint splashing sound. And you look at the pond, and what do you see but a child in danger of drowning? Now this is not a dangerous pond. Kids are dumb. They can basically drown in a bird bath if left alone. So you can walk into this pond. There's no dangerous current. There's no ravenous hippopotami. Pick up the kid and walk out. The worst that's going to happen to you is that you're going to be late for your class, or miss the start of your shift, or miss the beginning of Hot Kant Takes Manhattan. The question I have for you is, do you save the child? If yes, like this video. If no, subscribe to my channel. Wink. Now most of you are probably saying, of course I would save the drowning child. I'm not a raving sociopath, Dr. Blunt. And, I get it. You'd have to be a moral monster not to save this child. But I've got some bad news. According to Peter Singer, if you'd save the child, you should also give away almost all of your money to charity. Wait, really? Before we talk about the drowning child thought experiment, we might want to briefly look at what a thought experiment is to begin with. Now, thought experiments are basically as old as philosophy itself. You can go all the way back to Plato's Republic and read about the Ring of Gyges. So Plato, Socrates, and the gang, they sit around and they ask, well, what would it mean if you had a ring, boop, that would make yourself invisible? And from there, they start talking about what is a just man. Now, what are they doing here? They're saying, okay, under these particular conditions, which might be a little bit weird, what does it tell us about our moral intuitions on how we would behave and what it means to be a good person? And that's generally what most thought experiments do. They say, let's create a contained experimental environment, look at what our moral intuitions say, see if there's an argument underneath the intuitions, and then apply it out in the real world. Now, personally, I find thought experiments to be occasionally a bit annoying because they tend to be very improbable. They range into sort of fantasy, like a ring that makes you invisible, or science fiction, what about if you had 7 different clones of blah, 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 blah. One of the reasons I like Singer's argument is because it's not wildly improbable. It's entirely likely that you could walk past a pond one day and see a child in need of rescue. So why does Peter Singer think that if you'd save a drowning child, you also ought to give most of your money away to charity? Well, he says the moral argument behind one applies in the other. So let's look at this moral argument. It's pretty simple. It has 3 steps. The first step is that some things are bad. Drowning is bad. Living in poverty, also bad. Step 2. If it's in our power to stop a bad thing from happening, we ought to do it. If you can stop someone from drowning, you should. And if you can stop someone living in extreme poverty, you should. Step 3, it is in our power to do this. You can save someone from drowning. You can alleviate at least some poverty by giving to charity. Therefore, we reach the conclusion, you ought to save a drowning child and you ought to give away your money to charity. What I love about this argument is how simple it is. Singer creates a plausible moral framework and uses it to undermine our intuitions about distance. We think that if someone is right in front of you, this creates somehow an urgency, a responsibility. The drowning child needs to be saved because the drowning child is in front of you. He says, well, what work is distance doing? Does it matter if the child is in front of you or if a child is starving on the other side of the planet? What really matters is your ability to alleviate the bad thing from happening. And you can in both cases. One requires you to wade in, the other one requires you to open your wallet. Of course, Singer, being a philosopher, is not without his detractors. In order to explore the nuances of his argument, we're going to look at 4 important objections to the drowning child thought experiment and its conclusion. The first objection is that this argument is too demanding. The drowning child thought experiment is just a one-off. You walk in, you pull the kid, you walk out. Singer seems to think that this means that you should give away all your money, that you should sacrifice basically everything that makes life worthwhile in order to rescue distant strangers. You should sacrifice your commitment to your friends, your family, to self-actualization, to pleasure. All of these luxuries can just be pushed away in order to save lives. Now, what the critic will say is that this is an inhuman form of ethics. Ethics needs to appeal to human beings as they actually are and take our commitments, our other moral commitments, seriously. We have a wide array of social and moral commitments that are worthwhile. Singer is asking us to burn them all down, to pursue distant strangers. It's just not something people are able to do. Singer takes this objection on board. In fact, he took it on board fairly early. He first articulated this argument in 1972, and he said, okay, fine. You don't have to give away everything to charity, but let's amend that second point and say, if you can prevent something bad from happening without sacrificing something of comparable moral importance, you ought to stop something bad from happening. So if we are going to sacrifice something that we have strong reason to value, something that's comparable to the bad we're trying to stop, then we can say, actually, I have a prior existing commitment and I won't be rescuing you from extreme poverty today. Apologies. Now, the trick here is that he says comparable moral value. He's talking about saving innocent people. There's not much that compares to that, if we're being honest. I certainly couldn't say, well, look, I want to buy an expensive painting, or I want to, buy the latest, collab sneakers that cost $700. That's just not going to be on, right? So he also has sort of wheeled it back a little bit. He says the ethical thing to do is to give away all of your money, up to the point that you're not sacrificing something of comparable moral value. But in the case of ordinary people, you should just give a lot, just a general a lot. For example, Bill Gates, right? He's given away almost half, I think, of his net worth to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. The effective altruist, William McCaskill, lives on £26,000 a year. Everything else goes to charity. Singer himself gives away, I think, about half of his income to charity. Now, this is not sort of reducing yourself to being a Diogenes-style character living in a tub and sort of being a public filth beast, but it is a significant sacrifice. It's certainly more than I give to charity each year. So, it's demanding, but it's doable. And Singer's reply is that, look, I get it. It's demanding. Ethics are demanding. This is why we have things like moral philosophy, because sometimes we need to understand why the hard thing is worth doing. The second objection is that it's not demanding enough. I know, it sounds crazy, but it comes from global egalitarians. They say that Singer's solution to global poverty doesn't actually solve any of the causes of global poverty. They say that if we want to actually deal with people living in pretty horrible conditions, we need to change basically the entire way we run the world. And Singer doesn't provide a solution to this. And Singer agrees. But he says that's not what he's interested in. He can get behind efforts to reform the global economy, but he's interested in people who are suffering and dying right here, right now. Literally, while you are listening to this video, someone is dying from poverty-related causes. He wants to alleviate their suffering because these big global egalitarian reforms, they're decades away at best, and there are people right now who need help. And you know what? That's kind of a fair cop. The third objection is that this is self-defeating. Now, this comes from neo-Malthusians like Garrett Hardin, who say that if we start giving money away to charity, it's actually going to produce net negative effects over the long term. You might alleviate someone's suffering today, but that suffering person is going to have a family, and they're going to increase the number of people living in poverty. If we want to make the world better, we just need to let the excess population die off. It's some hardcore, unreformed Ebenezer Scroogeism. But here's the problem with Hardin's thought experiment. It doesn't describe the world we live in. This is a danger when we do thought experiments. We create a sealed micro-universe that might be pretty different from the one that we inhabit. One thing that we know in development is that if you improve people's welfare, especially when you improve women's access to healthcare and employment, population stabilizes or drops. People have fewer children. If you're not worried about infant mortality, you have fewer children. If you are not subjected to patriarchal control, you have fewer children. If we want to reduce the human population, or at least hold it stable, you don't do it by starving people out. That might be counterproductive, because after all, people know where the lifeboat is, Garrett. The final objection is about institutions. There's an important disanalogy between the drowning child and alleviating severe poverty. And that is how we go about doing it, the power to stop the bad thing from happening. Now, in the first case, the power is literally in you and me. You can walk into the pond, pick up the kid, and pull them out. But that same power doesn't exist with severe poverty. You're not going to get on a plane and fly to a country that has severe poverty to help out. Singer wants you to write a check. And a check requires a charity, or if you're very wealthy, a philanthropic foundation. A lot of people kind of intuit this when they're skeptical about charities. A lot of people say, well, I don't give to charity because charities tend to spend all of their money on administration, and that's not helping the people who need help. Well, this isn't actually the huge problem they think it is. Charities tend to be well run, and there are a lot of sort of resources from effective altruists about how to give most effectively to people. I tend to think it's by giving directly to people living in severe poverty, but that's just me. But there's another issue that sort of even the effective altruists don't really get a handle on, and that is the nature of the institutions that are alleviating poverty. See, they are affecting people's fundamental rights. They are becoming agents of justice, and we will want control over any institution that affects our basic rights. And Singer just doesn't really care about the nature of these organizations, but he should. In 2002, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees and Save the Children UK launched an investigation into allegations of abuse in West African refugee camps. They found that women and young girls had experienced sexual exploitation from aid workers, people working for MSF, International Committee of the Red Cross and Red Crescent, the American Refugee Committee. All of these major NGOs were embroiled in this scandal. They found that these women were vulnerable to exploitation because these aid workers controlled access to important social goods like employment and health care. They also didn't know that they had rights that could be enforced against them. They thought they were powerless. In these circumstances, they experienced extreme injustice from people who were supposed to help them. So the problem of alleviating global poverty, even if we're dealing with a triage situation like Singer says, is a bit more complicated than pulling a child out of a pond. And that's the end of the video. Thanks for watching, and keep tuning in. The new videos are going to track the ethical dilemmas that pop up as I research my new book. Take care, everyone.